Do I need mine? Okay. We can share.
Your mic is on like
Osters. I'm hot. Coming in hot tonight. I think you'll adjust me here once we start talking.
Okay. All right. Thank you for being here. I'd like to call to order the regular meeting of the Vail School District Governing Board at 7:06 p.m. First item on our agenda is the Pledge of Allegiance. Would you please join me? I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is approval of minutes. Consideration of approving the minutes from the regular governing board meeting held on June 11, 2024 as presented. Is there a motion to approve?
Motion to approve as presented.
Mr. Buster moves. I'll second. And Mrs. Anderson second. I'll go ahead and go for the questions. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Not seeing any, the motion carries. Next item on the agenda is general functions. Call to the public. At this time, the board may consider and discuss comments and concerns of the public. Those wishing to address the governing board on items not on tonight's agenda may do so at this time. I don't have any requests to speak. Is there anybody here that would like to make a request? We can also consider items that are on tonight's agenda. Is there anybody here that wishes to speak on items on tonight's agenda? Not seeing any, we'll go ahead and move forward to the superintendent's report.
Thank you. Thank you, President Tippett, members of the board. Just a couple of quick acknowledgements. We just want to acknowledge that tonight's meeting is a little shorter. We've removed the special announcement section from our standard regular agenda because it is summer and much of our staff is taking advantage of a slower pace. If they're not on vacation, they're not wanting to come in and participate at a 7 o'clock meeting. We want to give them that opportunity. Thank you for doing so. And the other reason is there's just not as much going on to have special recognitions about. So we will resume those pieces of our agenda when we flip the calendar in July. I also want to acknowledge that on Monday, speaking of flipping the calendar, July 1st, we will begin with new teacher induction. So the pace of things accelerates quickly in less than a week. So we'll be full across the way in the blue room for the next couple of weeks as we do K-8 induction and then high school induction following that.
Wonderful.
That's all I have.
Next item on the agenda is board reports. Are any board members wanting to make a report tonight? Mr. King.
Sure, I got one. It's actually, I was talking to Cindy before the board meeting. It's been about 6 weeks since it was my last board meeting. It's the first part of May. So I don't have that long of a board report though. So for the board report though, I do have that. I did get to attend all of the graduations. So I get to see all of the kids graduate this past summer. So on top of that, I attended the ASBA Summer Leadership Institute with Ed, and we got to spent a lot of time actually interfacing with a lot of different people up there, and it turned out to be really, really good, especially seeing a lot of people and attending all the various alliances, conferences, and breakout sessions, and seeing that, you know, Ed and I were able to model that we can disagree without being disagreeable. But the thing is, Ed and I didn't disagree, but we got to see a lot of disagreement up there, and it was actually kind of interesting to see kind of some of the angst between some of the other board members and districts. So, but we actually modeled what it's actually like to be professional up there. So it was really great. Additionally, I was afforded the opportunity to chair a couple of committees at the School Board Association. I would chair the governance committee. So we're in the process of rewriting bylaws and the internal policies, as well as recently chaired the legislative committee meeting. And as I called John, I was like, oh, by the way, did you know I was the chair of this meeting? And he goes, when did you find out? I said, about 5 minutes ago. So I got a very, very short notice that I was chairing the meeting. So, but it did turn out great. So, and the reason I wasn't here at the last meeting is one of my duties as the co-director for Pima County and the School Board Association is, we decided as a board of directors that we were going to be a very visible and working board. So I attended the Baba Keevery board meeting at the beginning of this month, and I attended it as the co-director for Pima County, and it provided a really great perspective on how other boards do things, how they interact with one another, how they have the relationships that the board members have with their superintendents, and being able to see the differences, as well as seeing the community differences as well, seeing how they interact with one another, as well as providing an opportunity to bring back items that are successful, as well as sharing information with other boards. So, and fostering relationships with board members and other superintendents. So that concludes my board report.
Thank you, Mr. King. And with that, we'll go ahead and move forward to the consent agenda. All items listed below are consent matters and will be considered by one motion at this time. There will be no discussion of consent items. Any board member may remove an item from the consent agenda by request. All items not accepted and approved as part of the consent agenda will be considered individually. Do any board members wish to pull an item from the agenda? Not seeing any, I'll go ahead and accept a move. I ask Mr. Crew to make a motion.
Thank you. It's recommended that the Vail School District Governing Board approve all items on the consent agenda as presented.
You'll accept a motion.
So moved.
And,
Seconded.
Mr. King moves and Mr. Buster seconds. I'll go ahead and call for the question. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Not seeing any, the motion carries. The next item on the agenda is new business. The first thing we'll be discussing is a la carte fee structure for families utilizing ESA funds. Mr. Crew.
Thank you, President Tippett, members of the board. This is a study item. And I just want to preface by saying we have a long history in Vail of supporting families in whatever avenue they choose to educate their children. It's one of the reasons we have so many differently sized schools, different kinds of programs. As we recognize that children and families don't fit into one particular model, that they need a variety of ways. That has included providing support for families who choose to homeschool their children. If they want to have their child attend one of our classes or attend a club or an activity, we've allowed them to do that as long as there's space available. Oftentimes, most often that happens in the high school level with things like band or orchestra or choir or an athletic program, and as well as some upper division courses. We always have a handful of students young people that fall into that category. I would say less than 10 is a pretty historical average. So when we've done that for a number of reasons. One, when a family has chosen to homeschool their children, they make that declaration with the Pima County School Superintendent, and they assume that responsibility. Historically, they had not received any additional funding for doing that. They just did it on their own. Well, that all changed about 2 years ago when empowerment scholarships were made available to any family. What we've seen, so we've been watching what has happened with that. So a couple of things that have happened with that. If a family takes an ESA, an empowerment scholarship is called an ESA, and receives those funds for a base standard student, that's about $7,000. They cannot take those dollars and then co-enroll a student into a school district, and the school district count that participation and receive reimbursement for that student as well. So historically, if a kid came, they took a chemistry class for us, they're a homeschool kid, it's great. We just signed them up for their one class and then would be able to receive reimbursement for the state for that portion of their FTE for their not FTE, for their average daily membership, ADM. And we would receive that back. You can't do that if you're taking an ESA, because that would be considered double dipping. So we would not have a way to receive any funds to offset the cost of supporting that student. So we are now in a position where we're really looking at doing a la carte services, a pay schedule, so to speak, for families who take ESA, who want to utilize those same services. So we've been watching what other districts around the state have been doing over the last couple of years, and we've been watching what's happening here in our own local district in Vail. And a couple of things have happened. One, most school districts, if a family takes an ESA, don't allow a family to then partake in services from that school district. I would say that is the majority stance. That doesn't feel right to us. A few districts, one of them being Mesa, has created a long list of a la carte services. I provided some of that in the additional background material. I can read them off if you have questions about what that looks like. It's literally multiple pages long. And some of the fees are quite steep. So that didn't quite feel right to us either. So Mr. Hurley and Mrs. Pinkerton began kind of combing through those things and reaching out and asking others and putting together a recommendation for us. And that's what we have here before you. And I wouldn't even say it's a recommendation at this point. It's really just a draft consideration. We're not, there isn't a time clock ticking on this. We don't have to have something in place in the next couple of weeks or months. We just want to begin to consider what we can do with that. But what you have here is in front of you is a draft consideration of an a la carte services that would allow participation in after-school clubs, middle school athletics, middle school elective courses, middle school core courses, high school core courses, high school elective courses, high school clubs, and high school athletics, as well as our online courses. The dollar amounts are listed there. So if you took a high school course, for example, chemistry, that same chemistry course, and I loaded up a previous draft, so you may have seen that. This is the corrected one. If you take a high school chemistry course with us, it would cost $1,200 for the entire course, for the year's course, so $600 per semester, which is commensurate with what we would receive in ADM reimbursement if we were able to receive funding back from the state for that. It's less than what Mesa is charging. I believe Mesa is charging $1,400 per semester per course, as an example. To participate in a K-12 after-school club would be $750 per club. For middle school athletics, would be $750 per season. For high school course with extracurricular performances, so think band, choir, music, those kinds of things, it would be $2,000 per course, because there's a significant component of practice, travel, all of those other components in there. And then high school athletics would be $2,000 per season. Again, that may seem steep, but for those who have children in club athletic activities, just think about what you pay for a season relative to that. And while those are, or they're making some money, they're not making a large profit off of those things. There's a reason for that. And if you were going to participate in our volleyball program, it's likely going to be something that extends beyond just the core season. You're also going to be participating in conditioning and other things that are outside of it. So that's kind of the general overview. Mrs. Pinkerton is here to answer any questions or fill in any gaps that I didn't provide. And I think before I turn it over to you for questions, I'll just ask Mrs. Pinkerton, is there anything generally that I missed as far as the background that you think we should add at this point?
President, members of the board, not at this time, we kind of got everything. The one little piece that we considered was students who may in choir and wants to enroll in a class who maybe receive special services. And there is some wording that we've got from the special ed department in terms of what and I have to read it because it's like, you know, their words, but we would provide the proportional share obligations for SPED students. We would meet those with what we already do with SPED students who are in the district. We have to provide a minimum of 30 minutes a week, and we would still do that with any students that would want to enroll in any of these courses.
Thank you. The one other thing I would add, again, this is historically, this is what we've done, this is what we would continue to do. We would accept enrollment in those courses or programs as there's space available. Obviously, that would depend on the program. Programs are probably easier to provide space than courses. I think that's kind of it as a general overview. So with that, happy to answer any questions. And again, just frame it up as this isn't something there isn't a fire burning on this. It's just something that we feel that we want to put into place as we move forward at some point if we're going to consider this. What I would say is that small handful of students that we now serve, we've done some informal polling of them, and they're all taking essays. So what it used to be was that wasn't the case. Now if you homeschool your child, you're taking an ESA. So.
Okay. Any questions? Discussion? Mr. King.
Yes, thank you. Some of the questions that came up was if the students enroll for the athletics or the clubs or everything else, is this funding here going to be all inclusive for like liability, insurance, equipment, things like that? Is the district going to be protected under that piece, under that funding?
So I may need to get back to you on some of the specifics of that, but Mrs. Kiodos is also here. In general, our liability funding is what it is as far as we have that regardless of which students are there. If they enroll with us in that program, then they would be covered with us because they're enrolled with us. This is, I guess another way of saying this is we tuition in students from other school districts, and we've done that for years. While they live in another school district, they actually pay us tuition for that kid. It's really no different than this. Instead of paying for the entire tuition, this would be more of an a la carte thing. I'm selecting this particular program or course to be able to do. So from a liability standpoint, I don't see any issue. Mrs. Kiddos is shaking her head no. From a cost standpoint, I'll just use football as an example. There may be some additional costs above what the base amount would provide that we ask all students who are participating in that to cover, or band or choir or any of the other things. It's not unusual for there to be additional costs above what the base costs are to participate, but this would allow participation. The cost would allow participation in that program, and then they would be subject to whatever additional requests, I guess, are necessary for, sometimes it's equipment or travel or whatever that they fundraise for, those kinds of things.
Any other questions? Mr. King.
Okay, you were talking about SPED funding as well. Because the ESAs, they do get proportional SPED funding, would that also be included into the SPED requirements for those who enroll that need those SPED services?
Mrs. Pinkerton, I think that, so we may not have that level of detail. So
Okay.
what you're, let me just reframe what I think you're asking. So as I mentioned, the base level of funding a student might get is $7,000. If you're a student who receives special education services, you might get, you get an add-on weight depending upon what qualifying category you receive. Would we receive a proportional share of that? I think that's probably a level of detail we need to work out, but I think the language we would add in there is that it would be a proportional share of that base amount. So I I used to have it committed to memory what each of the categories reimbursements were, but they've changed them over the last couple of years. So like a student with a learning disability is maybe receives another $1,000 or so on top of that. We would receive a proportional share of that as an amount. Yeah. Or a student with autism is significantly more. That might be a piece of that. Yeah.
No thoughts about this?
We're happy to slow walk this too. I just say that. I mean, if I know Mrs. Pratt is not here, we're happy to bring it back for a study next time if we want to do that. Well, Mrs. Pratt's here. I know we're swapping out Mrs. Pratt for Mrs. Anderson next board meeting, but that would maybe give it some time to sink in. And if you think of other questions you want to ask, we're happy to do that. I think the one other thing we were talking about as far as clubs are concerned is that for the K-8 clubs, we wouldn't allow participation in K-8 clubs that would require travel outside of the school district or outside of the area, overnight travel, just because of a liability issue on being able to track that student and family.
I'm wondering how this will function around kiddos who decide to enroll in early college. I know that we've had several kids come out of homeschool to participate in early college. Like, will there be a particular deadline to end their ESA, or do they have to like apply every year for it? I just want to make sure that we have language around that to make sure that families who are interested in that program can disengage from the ESA altogether so that they can participate.
So as long as they're a K-12 student, so there's a couple of prongs in your question. Well, we can push into that and ask more, but there's a couple of prongs in your question. The first prong is that if a family has to reapply or continue every year for ESA funds. That's been in place. It's pretty much once you're in, it's an automatic renewal though. So they would need to, when you stop being a part of an ESA, you need to notify the ESA department and within the Department of Ed that you're stopping. So that's would be on the parent side. For early college, our is if we were able, we charge them for the courses they took, as long as they're a student, a K-12 student, and they're receiving K-12 dollars, I really wouldn't, I mean, it would almost be up to the family to decide, is it better for them to continue with the ESA and pay us, I don't know, 4 courses for going to PIMA, or is it better to take their, I would imagine you can use ESA funds as a 16-year-old to go to PIMA. I don't know. I don't know what the rules are on that. I mean, PIMA accepts students that are not high school or not high school graduates. So right. I don't know what the conditions are around what PIMA does with ESA or what community colleges do with ESA. So that's out of our, that's one area we haven't pushed into, but we could see what that looks like.
Yep. Mr.
So how many classes can an ESA student take before they end up hitting that tipping point where now you've gone over that and you're actually more of a traditional student? You should actually be enrolled versus, you're coming in on an a la carte basis because now you've purchased the whole meal.
I would say that's completely up to the family to determine. So the majority of students, the majority of families who take ESAs use those funds to pay for, to offset costs for private education, for private school education. So they're taking their again, as a base number, they're taking their $7,000, applying it to South Point, whose tuition is $14,000, $15,000. And they're paying in addition to the $7,000 they get. I mean, they would need to make that determination themselves on what they would want to do if they want to, take 5 courses with us, and pay us any additional amount. That's up to them. I mean, that's up to them on what they would choose to do it. It would seem to not be financially prudent to do that, but then I guess you could argue that with taking those funds and going to a private school too, but that's the difference being you can't unenroll from ESA and get free South Point High School. So, or whatever, I'm just using that because it's the largest one in town, not to single them out by any means, so.
Any other comments or questions? I'm generally supportive of the concept. I think that is what the intention of the ESA is for the parent to be able to choose what they want for their kiddo's education, and they can apply those dollars where they'd like. Mr. King?
I attended a meeting with the Department of Education ESA lady last year, and John, it was we talked about this last year, and it's good to see this actually coming to fruition, not just here but around the state, and trying to make sure that we're providing a service to the kids, right, and the families.
I think there's a lot of programs that we have that local families would definitely be interested in participating in. Okay, if there's not any other comments or questions, we'll go ahead and move forward to item B, which is the 2024-2025 proposed district budget. Mr. Groot.
Mrs. Kudos. As she's coming to the podium, I'll just say this is the budget that we have been studying since February, about looking back at our current year budget and then basing building blocks from there forward on what funding we have for FY25. I will also say that while we are proposing we have a recommendation to propose a budget to you this evening, the overwhelming majority of the pieces of the budget, the board has already approved via actions around salary increases, contracts, and employee benefit packages. All of those things we did with the knowledge of, we understood where we were financially. That's the reasons where those were brought forward at that time, that and the timeliness of needing to do that, so our staff knew where we were headed. Those components alone, staffing comprises roughly just under 90% of our M&O budget. So anyways, with that, Mrs. Kudos.
Members of the board, the budget that's presented to you this evening is, just like Mr. Kruth had said, items that we've been working on since February. We've brought, we did a projection. We had incorporated a 2% increase in our funding per student. So we were really close to what the actual amounts came in to be. I appreciate your patience as we were waiting for the Auditor General's office to push through the final forms for us to use, which they did that on Friday. So I just want to hit some of the highlights of what we took into consideration when we built that projection, the budget projection. The first thing obviously was looking at student enrollment. And we spent a lot of time throughout the district looking at those enrollment growth projections that we do every year. We are seeing about 0.25% of growth in kindergarten through 8th grade, and about a 3% growth at our high school level. So we took that into consideration. We knew we were going to get the 2%, and so that came to fruition, which is about $98.29 per student that we receive in funding. We did see an increase in our average route miles that we travel, and then the eligible students. So we saw a little bit of a bump in our transportation funding this year, which is about $140,000. We also were able to recalculate our 12.5% M&O override. We do that every single year. And that's based off of our enrollment for 24, but funding for 25. And so we saw a little bit an increase there. It was a little over $563,000. Prop 123 funding, we saw some changes in that, and that's just because that factor gets recalculated frequently at the state level. And so when they recalculated it for us at the end of this year, it changed just a little bit. And so we use that same number as we were building into our fiscal year 25 budget. Like we were just talking about those tuition in students, we do have one child from Tinker Verde, and we saw an increase of about $12,000 for that one child. Collectively, we received about $76,000 for that one child, a special needs student, but just to give you an idea of the cost of tuition. We also, one of the things that we did change from when we were working on all of the projections is we talked about the one-time funding. If you remember, we started at the 3.6 million and we kept it in our M&O budget. And as we kind of worked through the budget projections and looking at future forecasting of what we wanted to do with those funds, we kept $1.6 million in our M&O budget for fiscal year 24 to use for 25. So, and then the other 2.3 million, I think it was, put into capital. We won't see that line in this budget because that was a one-time funding in 24. We do roll that money over and it becomes just part of our carry forward, but that is earmarked for incentive payments that will be paid in August and September. And that was an item that the governing board has already approved, and that was back in May 14th. So even though it's not a line item on the budget, in our calculations, if you look at one of the pages, it is something that we've already taken into consideration with that carry forward. You'll see a little bit of a change in our carry forward, and that's just because where we're at right now, we're trying to close out the end of this fiscal year. We still have about $4 million encumbered. We have 2 more payrolls to process. We're just trying to wrap up all of our purchase orders and things of that nature. So we'll see that carry forward change, and we'll get a final number for that in October. But for right now, we feel comfortable using about $11 million carry forward. What we saw is a net increase, and that's a change from our revised budget, which we just did in May, to now what we're starting with for fiscal year 25 is just under $400,000. But it's really close to what we were expecting when we were looking at all of our projections. Just a couple of the things I wanted to highlight about the expenditures that we had planned on. The board had approved back in May also. We've done a lot of study on percentage increases for base pay and what that would look like for our school district, and to keep us competitive and be able to recognize the hard work of our staff and really focus on what our overall goals are here at the district. And so that was approved back in May, and that was a 3%. That cost about $2.8 million for just our M&O budget. All employees get that 3%, and depending if they're out of grants or whatever, there's other funding sources to cover those expenses. We also did a 2% increase to our pay guide, and that's just to help us stay competitive. That again was approved on May 14th. One of the things that we did this year and for the FY25 budget is we incorporated the last of our COVID positions that will be transferring over into our M&O, and that will happen probably in September. We have 4 positions, and that's very, very few. We had a really amazing transition program compared to where we were a couple of years ago with all of the positions that we had under COVID funding. And so we've incorporated that into the budget also. Plus, we've had some growth, and with growth, we're adding positions. We've also looked at adding positions to like one at transportation just to help with the overall operations of some of our different departments. And we also did some restructuring of our benefits program. And I don't know if you remember, it was back in March, it was presented to you. There was a committee that came together. They looked at just the way our contribution schedules were prepared. Very difficult to understand how much the district actually contributes as opposed to what the employee is expected to pay. And so that was restructured to make it very clear now how much the district covers and how much the employee would be responsible for. That cost us a little over $180,000. And then we also had our benefit renewal this year. We have ASVATE as our medical. We saw a little under 11% increase, and that's pretty normal with what's going on with market right now. And then we saw about a 4.5% increase with our dental plan. All of that was presented to the board and approved back in March. We did our open enrollment, so everything's working well. Any questions on the budget that was presented to you?
Yeah, why don't I go ahead and make recommended action, and then we'll open it up for questions. Is that okay? So the recommended action is that the Vail School District Governing Board approve the 2024-2025 proposed budget for publication as presented, and set the public hearing for adoption on July 9th, 2024 at 7 p.m. at the Calvin Baker Leadership Center, located at 13801 East Benson Highway, Vail, Arizona.
I'll accept a motion.
Motion to approve as presented.
Mr. Buster moves
Second.
and Mr. King seconds. Any comments or questions?
Outstanding job.
Anybody else?
As I say, this, like the legislature came like right down to the wire. So Michelle, thanks for everything, you know, putting you and all the staff and getting all this put together like last minute. So thanks to the legislature dilly-dallying.
I appreciate how we work this process. It's systematic that we start early. And the first conversations are around enrollment and we build from there. And I have just always appreciated watching it develop and understanding it so deeply along the way, because when each piece is added to the puzzle, I get to digest that piece rather than looking at one huge budget at one time with a whole bunch of new moving parts. So I appreciate the process. And I'm grateful for a budget that allows us to get a 2% increase. I'm a little worried about Prop 123 funding going forward and what we do when we lose $12 million.
It's actually about $900,000.
Oh,
So it's not as bad as I thought it was. I think I used $5 million in a conversation with you. I was corrected by Mrs. Kiddos.
900,000. That sounds.
That's,
a little bit
it's still,
easier.
that's still not, yeah,
Yeah.
that's still a stings, but not a, it's not a gash in the hole.
Right. Right. So I just, when we did our last look at the budget on the sheet that has the column A, B, and C, and the yellow column is, what was the carry forward that we last kind of considered? It feels like 11 million is larger.
Mrs. Kiddos?
President Tippett, Mr. Caruth, members of the board, it was at 9 million.
Yeah.
But remember I was explaining to you the one-time money, that's not
So it's
incorporated.
now in that bucket. Got it.
Along with also just watching what's going on with our expenditures of this thing.
Well, it sounds like you had it really dialed in. Any other comments or questions?
I have one other comment. There was additional funding that we will be receiving. It's the district additional assistance and the free and reduced price lunches. Those are funding, one-time funding amounts that we'll receive. There's been no calculations. And so once those calculations are provided and shared, we'll come back and probably do a revision at some point. And we'll share what those amounts are. But at this point, the state has told us to leave all those lines blank in the budget.
And is that related to the change in funding for free and reduced lunch, where the reduced lunch portion is either shrinking or going away? And it's just going to be free?
Mrs. Kiddos?
So President Tippett, Mr. Cluth, members of the board, we just received notification today from the Department of Education that reduced meals will be free again, but this is totally separate. This is funding that goes into our maintenance operation or capital budget, where that funding goes right into our food service fund.
Got it.
Two different areas.
Thank you.
I just want to make a couple of comments. First of all, I just want to commend Mrs. Kiddos and her team for the work and ensuring that we're on very solid footing financially. So that's one. Mrs. Kiddos spent a good chunk of Sunday taking those forms that she received late Friday and updating them. That's an example of things that happen frequently. Second comment, I just want to acknowledge, if people are, somebody's out there watching on June 25th, is our maintenance and operation budget. The budget that we are proposing is our budget limit. So we can budget up to that amount. We just can't budget over that amount. And that's based on all of the funds that Mrs. Kiddos is describing, whether that's our base support level or other components that provides a limit that we can spend up to. And that's the budget that we're proposing. Operationally, we have all of the things that we're doing, positions and other expenses that we know that we have been working on and developing for months that will operate below the threshold of that limit. And that's where we are. So
carry forward as a cushion underneath that, and then we won't, and then we have a little bit of room right below that cap. That's the proposed budget. Budgets are fluid based on what our funds are, based on what our expenditures are, and that's why we revise them throughout the year, and why Mrs. Quiros and her team monitor all of those pieces. So also the next action is to, after this action, is to actually adopt that proposed budget, and then we will be on to understanding what the closeout is and what our actual is later in the fall. We'll be reporting back. So just is kind of a timeline. It feels like this is kind of a final act. It's really not. It's a one step in an ongoing budget process that's basically a year-round process.
It's a great explanation. All right, I'll go ahead and call for the question. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Not seeing any, the motion carries. Next item on the agenda is adjournment. I'll accept a motion. Mrs. Anderson moves
Second.
and Mr. Buster seconds. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Not seeing, the motion carries. Thank you.